3, 2, 1. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another wonderful event with the Center for Global Education. Today, we will be talking about Black Lives Matters in Canadian schools, and we'll be bringing together schools from across Canada, around the world, to talk about this important topic, something that's really going on in our society today that's impacting all of us it doesn't matter our age, it doesn't matter our location. This is something that's impacting our lives and has really come to the forefront of our recognition and our acknowledgement. And it's always been here. It's always been something that we've needed to talk about. Always probably been something that we've wanted to talk about. But here we are today to engage in this topic and really ask ourselves, what does Black Lives Matter? How does that matter? How does this topic implicate our schools? How does it implicate ourselves in our how we interact with our fellow students and our teachers and our communities? This event today is co-hosted with the Canadian Commission for UNESCO. CC-UNESCO helps Canadians share knowledge locally and globally in order to create better societies and build peace in the minds of men and women and all people. To do so, the Commission facilitates cooperation in the fields of education, science, culture, communication, and information to address some of the most complex challenges facing the world today. And I think that our topic today on Black Lives Matter is one of those very important topics that they'd like to bring youth together across Canada to talk about. We are joining you virtually and from all over the country. We have schools from Vancouver, from Nunavut, from Toronto, from Nova Scotia, all across our great country. And so I would like to begin by acknowledging all the Indigenous people from all the lands that we are on today. While we might be meeting on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of lands in which we all call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nation peoples that call this land home. Now, I want to, today I'm just here in a wonderful welcoming capacity with our friends from CC-UNESCO, but our host is Destin Lord. And she is a consultant, communicator, connector, and facilitator working towards the elimination of racism in Canada. And for the last 10 years, she's worked across the country in both private and public to facilitate workshops and training sessions like this, related to risk and change and reconciliation and building awareness across our culture. She's an honor degree in mass communication from Carleton and a master's degree in journalism from Bonn University. She's a news junkie, as am I, and is news just sort of all seeped in our lives right now. And she's very interested in how media can shape our perceptions of the world and the people around us. So I want to welcome everyone. And Destin, I'd love to turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that warm welcome. I'm so happy to be here today. Normally, I'm the one that usually does all the talking and takes all the attention and the focus, but I'm happy to report that that is not my role today. I'm here to moderate the conversation, to guide the discussion, but what I'm really here to do is to seed space to young voices, the voices that are at the center of the movement. And when I say the movement, I'm talking about the connection between Black Lives Matter and how the issues related to Black excellence, Black support, and Black advocacy around social justice issues are linking up at the high school level. So joining me today, and I just want to be able to share my screen and give my co-hosts the attention that they really deserve. I want to just acknowledge that I'm here to sort of create a space for two very impressive young ladies. Aaliyah Clark and Courtney Kahn are grade 12 students at David Suzuki Secondary School in Brampton, Ontario. And while their priority is to go to school and focus on their education and do their very best, they have also taken on the additional role of joining an advocacy group, a social justice group at their school called United Souls. United Souls is dedicated to supporting Black excellence in every single way. And while I can only talk about it as an outsider, I'm hoping that the information that we share with you today will help you see how Aaliyah, Courtney, and their peers on United Souls have made real a lot of that advocacy work in response to the challenges that Black students face in an academic environment. I want to turn it over now to Courtney Kahn to explain United Souls, what it is and what they do. So Courtney, over to you.
Hi, I'm really happy to be here today. As Destin explained, United Souls is a BSA at our school, at David Suzuki Secondary School, which is a Black Student Association, and we work to support the well-being of Black students at David Suzuki. We also work to ensure that other students from other cultures have an understanding of the Black experience, and we create a safe space. And that's what a BSA is, and we really want to encourage BSAs forming in schools all around Canada.
Thank you, Courtney, for sharing a little bit about what United Souls does. But before we get into the presentation and the information that you and Aaliyah will share with us today, I think it's important for us to sort of set the context of what BSAs do and kind of the work that they're supporting. So to be clear, BSAs have existed long before the events that happened in the world this summer, and that is pertaining the murder of George Floyd. And so I want to set up the context of this work kind of in terms of how we talk about racism. And I want to link it back to how we can be more specific in what we talk about with our families, with our friends, amongst our peers as students and colleagues in a school environment. I think the standard definition is fairly clear in terms of the discrimination or antagonism that a particular group of people face based on their racial background. But why I think the work that's happening in schools around BSAs is that we're focused currently in this moment in time about talking about anti-Black racism. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge the specificity of anti-Black racism. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying that anti-Black racism is the only racism that exists in the world. And I'm not prioritizing anti-Black racism over other forms of racism. But I feel that we cannot talk about the work and the role of BSAs in a school environment if we can't really get into the specificity of what anti-Black racism is. And that's to say that anti-Black racism focuses on the historical context that Black people experienced in terms of colonization and slavery. And that sounds really academic and technical, and it might be really hard to, sort of disconnect what happened in the past to what's happening now. But what's important to understand is that a lot of the racism that Black people experience now links back to that historical context around slavery. And a lot of the challenges that young people are facing link back to their dehumanization, link back to the appropriation of their identity and their culture, all of which we can see in that historical relationship between colonization and slavery. So I just wanted to set up that sort of context because if we can see the dehumanization of Black people existing at a particular level, then it becomes all the more important for us to make the linkages between why BSAs are necessary and how it ends up giving voice to Black students and their peers and the people who want to support them. I think a great starting point for this conversation, though, is to talk about why we see anti-Black racism. And I think a really great way to think about this is what I call unconscious bias. Some of you might have heard of it referred to as implicit bias. But basically, it's the idea that regardless of whether we intend to or not, we might be acting on attitudes, stereotypes, patterns, and trends that really impact our decision making at such a deep level that we're not really aware that that is what is happening. And so I want to be clear, I'm not assigning value to bias. I'm not saying that it is a good thing or a bad thing, but I'm saying it's something that we all have. And when we can acknowledge bias, then we can have a really frank conversation about what to do next. And bias is not just within people, but it's within systems and institutions. And so I think now is a great point and a great place to turn it over to Courtney. And I'd love to hear from you, Courtney, in terms of the linkages between how bias is showing up in your life and what that means as you move through the education system. So Courtney, over to you.
Thank you, Destin. So, today I'll be addressing unconscious bias. Particularly, I want to talk about miseducation and underrepresentation within our school systems globally, and how this causes unconscious bias towards Black people from other races. So, the problem in our school systems is the material used in school omit the history and perspectives of the Black experience. Historical achievements of Black people are often purposely omitted, and in the textbooks we use in school systems, many achievements accredited to white scholars were actually first achieved by Black scholars. So I want to talk to you guys about the Pythagorean theorem, just as an example of this. You guys know this theorem as a squared plus b squared equals c squared. That's basic math that we start learning in grade 9. In our Western educational systems, we are taught that this theorem was discovered by the Greek philosopher Pythagoras around 500 BC. However, this theorem existed thousands of years before Pythagoras was born. Pythagoras learned this theorem when he traveled to Egypt and learned from the great Black Egyptian scholars. Pythagoras then brought his findings back to Europe. To this day, we give the credit of this mathematical finding to a man that did not create this equation, instead of giving the credit where it is due to the Black Egyptian scholars he learned it from. This is due to systemic racism entrenched in our educational system. Now, speaking from my own experience, I have never once seen a Black scholar, scientist, or mathematician referred to in a textbook or in other learning materials used in school. I have also never sat in a history class in which Black achievements post-slavery were ever spoken about or taught. So the fact that Black history is omitted from school systems has a great impact on the students in the long run. Let me give you guys a quick rundown of the way this system creates unconscious bias. So, when a white child grows up in a system that teaches them that Europeans achieved almost everything that allowed societal advancement, a feeling of supremacy over other races will naturally grow within that child. This feeling of supremacy causes this child to act out in negative ways towards Black people, whereas children of color who grew up in the same system will naturally grow a feeling of insecurity and self-hate because they are being taught their own people have not achieved anything. These feelings are not valid because history tells us people of color, Black people especially, have contributed great things to society today and to societies in the past. But within the educational system, children are not taught about these achievements. This paints a picture that Black people are not valuable contributors to society. Now, when white people and other people of color interact with Black people, there's a disconnect because the history of Black people is not understood or known. There's now a false belief from other races that Black people are not worth as much in society because they do not contribute. This is an unconscious bias. So, really, what the heck does this all mean? Because that can sound like really big words. I don't get it. What this means is, in essence, what I'm saying is in our educational systems, we are not directly teaching children to be blatantly racist. However, the materials we use to teach with give a false sense of superiority to non-Black students. This causes racist behavior and unconscious bias towards Black students. So sometimes for us students, there's not much we can do about what we are taught. So I want to give you guys some next steps as students. So for us students, we don't always have control over things we are taught in the education system. So I encourage you to educate yourselves, not only in school, but outside of school, so that you can gain a broader outlook on life. Make an attempt to understand and learn about other cultures. And don't always believe things you are taught right away. Do your own research and find your own comparable sources, because sometimes the systems we trust are not always built in our favor. So that's what unconscious bias is and how it impacts us in our school systems globally. I want you guys to work to identify unconscious bias when you see it and understand and learn other cultures so you can work past your own unconscious biases. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Destin. Thank you.
Uh, Thank you so much, Courtney, for walking us through that. And I think it's really obvious that you hit on something that is really important to me personally in terms of communicating around anti-racism work. And it's the idea versus intention versus impact. And as Courtney rightly pointed out, it isn't perhaps not the intention of the school system to omit the significant contributions of Black scholars, Black people, Black academics throughout history. However, whether that omission is accidental, it still has the impact of not having Black students see themselves represented in the curriculum. It still has the impact of students who are not Black understanding that Black people have contributed significantly to the world that exists around them. And I think once we let go of that connection between what our intention is versus what the impacts are, then we can have a really frank conversation about what that means for the young people that we work with every day. And I think once we empower young people, especially young Black people, to see themselves in the content that they're learning, to see themselves as examples used in the classroom of contribution to science, math, art, music, etc., I think that's when we'll see students really flourish. And it's not just about the Black students specifically. I think all students learn when we see examples of success outside of perspectives that are simply our own. So thank you, Courtney, for sharing that. And I think when we're talking about anti-racism, we're talking about bias, and we're talking about what that means for students in schools, I don't think we can have this conversation without talking about microaggressions. Now, microaggressions is a very large term, but I want to just, again, contextualize it in terms of what that might mean for us listening. When you hear the term microaggression, don't think of it as this large, complicated term. What I want you to think of when you hear microaggression is the everyday, commonplace instances of racism to which Black people and other communities of color are subjected. We are going to focus on microaggressions that Black people are subjected to in the context of this presentation, because we are talking about BSAs, the Black Lives Matter movement, and what it means in our schools. But I want you to know that microaggressions do exist for other communities of color, but they might look different than the microaggressions that Black people face. And I think once you break down that definition to realize that it's just the everyday commonplace instances of racism, then we can let go of the idea that racism has to be this big, large, overt, obvious action. Sometimes it's the subtle microaggressions that are often the hardest to deal with. And sometimes it's the subtle microaggressions that present the most challenge for the young people in our spaces, the young people in schools. And so I think I want to turn it over to Aaliyah just to talk about microaggressions, what they mean and how it presents itself in the context of going to school, interacting with the education system, and the need for BSAs. So Aaliyah, let me turn it over to you.
Well, microaggressions are something that many Black students face no matter where they go. As Courtney explained, we now have an idea of where that rooted bias comes from, but now we must look at the way it is expressed. Coming from a young Black student herself, I have had several encounters, whether it be online, in stores, out and about, and in school. Our focus now is what happens within our school walls. Why? Because that's somewhere that every Black student will attend at some point in their life. We've all gone through and seen very negative connotations of Black people, whether it be Black men being aggressive, Black women being loud, young Black boys being portrayed as thugs or athletes, and our young Black girls being overly sexualized. As society continues to move forward, we're beginning to remove these stereotypes from what we deem as normal. This, however, does not mean it's been removed from our subconscious. After years of having these beliefs programmed into us through the media, our friends, family members, etc., this bias has sunk into what we would call our subconscious and is now shown through our actions and perceptions. This now has major effects on the way we act and view the Black community, as well as how the Black community sees itself. As Destin said, we need to stop thinking of racism as something blatant, like screaming the N-word at your Black peer student. But in reality, it's the shorter fuse teachers have towards Black students, the lower expectations we have of Black students, the less accessible needs for Black students, the lack of safe spaces for Black students, and the lack of respect for these students and their families. Did you know Black students are actually 4 times more likely to be suspended and 2 times more likely to be expelled? Contrary to popular belief, it's not because Black students have worse behavior than students of other ethnicities, but due to the fact that teachers and those in executive positions have a shorter fuse when it comes to Black students. This goes back to our subconscious bias, where even when Black students are very young, teachers still hold fear towards these children. This is also due to the fact that Black students are treated and viewed as older than they are. Why is it that Black students in high school are referred to as young men and women, and their white counterparts are seen as teens? This creates the illusion that Black students are older and less innocent, thus resulting in teachers and administration serving very harsh punishments compared to the counterparts. It has been proven that police officers feel this way, so why would our school staff be any different? Hence why our language towards Black students and their issues are so important. Black students are also more likely to be streamed applied than anyone else, um, while being discouraged from pursuing post-secondary education. This is due to a multitude of reasons. First, subconsciously, many guidance counselors don't think their Black students, specifically Black boys, are capable. This results in Black boys who are very capable to fly under the radar, and it makes them not receive the help that they need. From a young age, Black students are strung through the education system without getting the help they need and deserve. They are continuously ignored and not catered to. How many of your schools actually have a Black student association that advocates for the rights of Black students? Not as much as I would hope. Black students do not have a place in their schools that make them feel safe, causing them to look for refuge in other places. Our teachers' lack of understanding and awareness causes students to feel uncared for and teachers to make very ignorant mistakes. This results in situations of covert racism like Will Davies. He, surprisingly, is still a trustee for Peel after calling an elementary school with a high Black population named McCriminals. This is again due to the fact that Black students are seen as more aggressive than others. This puts prime light on the school to prison pipeline that many of our Black students face. Imagine what deeming a 10 to 13-year-old boy as a criminal will do to their self-image. It took the appeal board 8 months to apologize and no action was taken against Davies. Then we have more extreme cases like in Ottawa, Canada's capital. The university there underwent an incident of a teacher saying the N-word during class. When he was confronted, him and 34 other professors at the University of Ottawa proceeded to defend his actions as academic freedom. As a student of Peel, it is very disappointing to say that my school board is currently under investigation for anti-Black racism. I say this because I live in one of the most diverse places in Canada, and Canada is known to be the nicest and most accepting country in the world. So if I know that anti-Black racism is being experienced here, anti-Black racism is being experienced in schools everywhere. I also want to talk about the more so interactions that Black students may face. Why is it that Black students in a group are seen as suspicious and teachers will begin circling that group? If we're too loud, we're seen as rowdy and dangerous, but never kids that are excited for big plans after school. If we're too quiet, we're seen as suspicious and plotting, but never kids who are tired after long days of work. This is also a form of microaggression, because why is the actions of Black children not deemed normal? Why is it when I explain my feelings, I'm deemed loud, angry, and threatening when I'm really just sad and unmotivated? Why is it when I don't show up to class because I'm depressed, I'm suspended for being lazy and unruly when all I need was emotional support? Due to this, many Black students like me don't and won't receive the help they need. Black students are forced to validate themselves. I'm literally forced to sit here to prove to you that I deserve to be respected by my teachers, and it's appalling. Our society and our school boards need to do better because these statistics and survey results are not acceptable. So what do we now do about it? We need to look into our actions and reactions toward Black students, uproot that stubborn seed of racism. It may be difficult, but the lives of hundreds, thousands, maybe even millions of students depend on it. When we see racism and microaggression, we need to speak up because we'll only allow it to happen. We need to create safe spaces within our schools so that Black students are able to receive the love they need and might not receive in the classroom. As for my Black students, we need to heal. We need to deem ourselves worthy because no one can externally fix us when the power has been within us the whole time.
Aaliyah, thank you so much for sharing that experience and your experiences with me. And I think you provided some really great context in terms of some of the numbers that we see. I think one of the things that I really like advocating for is that data without context doesn't really get you anywhere. And I think a lot of times we see low performance numbers, low academic achievement of Black students, and it's very much characterized in specific language. And as we heard from Aaliyah, that language is often unfair because it's based on a legacy and history of discrimination and bias. So the question then remains on the table is what do we do about it? And when I say we as adults, we as students, we as teachers. So I'm hoping I can talk to you a little bit about what it means to be an ally in terms of methodology, a framework for considering your next steps. So I think first and foremost, before we get into that conversation, it's important that we define what is an ally. So an ally is someone who isn't necessarily a member of an underrepresented or marginalized group, but they do take action to support that group. And I think it's important to acknowledge that ally is just one word for it. There are many words to explain this action, and this might be a great place for you and your class to do some additional study. See what the words around ally are like. They're similar words: co-conspirator, accomplice. These are all synonyms and adjectives used to describe the actions of ally. I can't tell you that one word is better than the other, but know that when you see these words, they all have very specific meanings, but they're all getting at this idea that someone who isn't a member of an underrepresented or marginalized group is using their voice, their position, their privilege in support of a group that is marginalized or underrepresented. So what do allies do? Let me first talk to teachers and adults. The one thing I want you to know is that teachers and adults can be allies regardless of race. If you are not Black yourself, then perhaps you have additional privilege to bring to the table in support of Black students. Maybe this is taking an active role in your school's BSA. Maybe this is using your platform as a teacher to make space in order to allow Black students to advocate for the ideas, advocate for the concerns that they have that otherwise might not be heard in an administrative context. As adults and teachers, though, it's really important that we don't center ourselves in those conversations. Our role is not to talk about what we do as adults, what we bring to the table as teachers. Our role is to create a safe space for students, especially Black students, to feel comfortable sharing in the context of their BSA. So what does a safe space mean? A safe space means that we listen. We allow Black students and their peers the opportunity to share their lived experience and what they're going through. And as teachers and adults, we don't interject. We make room for those perspectives to be heard. As adults and teachers, we have plenty of time to share our opinions and thoughts in the context of a classroom and school space. But I want you to think about how you can give space for your students to raise those concerns, whether that's in the context of a BSA or not. The other skill that teachers and adults alike really need to practice if they're going to be allies is how do you practice your own self-awareness? And this is a really interesting part of this conversation. As adults, because we have more lived experience, we've been around longer, sometimes our perception is to share the best way to do things, to share our perspectives and knowledge. And while sometimes that can be helpful, asking yourself questions about, is this the best opportunity for me to talk? Maybe if I remain silent here, it might allow my students to share in a different way they didn't consider before. Asking these key questions in terms of who benefits from my actions and why am I doing this, that's a really great place that we as teachers and adults can make space for our students to share their feelings. And again, all of this, whether you're listening as an adult and teacher, whether you're practicing self-awareness, it involves the skill of listening, validating what your students are telling you, empathizing with them. And even though you may not be Black yourself, perhaps you can relate to the emotion of what's being shared. Perhaps you can relate to the experience. And then as an adult, as a teacher, how are you going to take action? Whether that's in the context of a BSA or just as a teacher at that school. And then last, I wanted the teachers and adults to consider how can you acknowledge your privilege and use it to create a platform for your students to be heard. I talked about this a little bit before, but are there opportunities for you to bring concerns forward from your students that might not otherwise be heard? The other part of this conversation that I want to get to is how can you as students be allies? Don't forget that you can support your peers. A part of this conversation is how do you support the mental health of those around you who may be experiencing racism as a result of bias in the system, as a result of not being seen in the lessons, as a result of not being reflected in the curriculum. How can you support your friends? Again, same rules apply. How are you listening? How are you showing up for them? How are you practicing the skill of being a good ally? And don't forget, perhaps you can play a role in your school's BSA. And I want to just flag to Courtney and Aaliyah, I'm going to ask you a question about this in a minute. What does your BSA membership look like? And I know a lot of people who want to be allies often have questions around this. So all this to say is we can't move forward in this conversation about how we support one another. We can't have successful BSAs unless we acknowledge that allies are a part of this conversation, and also listening to the students who are being impacted by these issues has to be our #1 priority when we work and when we learn from one another. So that said, Courtney and Aaliyah, I know you talked about the impact of United Souls when we've talked about it, but I want to open the floor to you and just ask you, who can join United Souls at your school and what has been the benefit of having the membership system that you do? I don't know who wants to start there.
I can start. So at United Souls, anybody can join. That's where our name comes from, United Front, a United Front of Souls. So all our BSA is a group of people that want to support and uplift the Black population and the Black student. So you don't need to be Black in order to support other Black people.
Mm-hmm. Courtney, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think when we first started, that was a bit of the confusion in our group was like, is this only for Black students? But I have Black friends and I really want to be able to support them. So what can I do? And that's when we really opened the floor for other students because we saw the need for others to understand the Black experience and getting other cultures involved, other ethnicities involved. It allowed them to open up their horizons and understand a lot more. And it brought more support and we were able to do a lot more because we had so many people being supportive.
Thank you so much for answering that question. I know that that's one that I get asked often when I go into support schools. Are BSAs limiting their membership to Black students only? And I think it's important to acknowledge that you don't have to be Black to join a BSA. I think everyone can support Black excellence and vice versa. Black students can support other groups within their school as well. So it's officially question time. If there are questions that you want Courtney or Aaliyah or myself to respond to, please feel free to use the chat. I'm gonna ask Sarah to help me moderate that chat and talk about some of the questions that are coming up. I know we have participants joining us live through YouTube, so start firing away, and we're here to just have an open dialogue about Black student associations, what they look like, and how you can start one in your school if that's something that you're interested in doing.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This is just such a fantastic event. The comments online and the comments here in the classroom, everyone's just really learning a lot. And I mean, it makes a difference to hear someone's lived experiences. And so one of the first question that came that we see here is from participant Chloe, who's here in Canada. And she was wondering, Aaliyah, you were talking about suspension rates and expulsion rates and why some students were suspended more than expelled and what the difference. And can you talk a little bit more about that, and what does that what does that mean, and where do those stats come from, and how do you see it playing out in your school? There's just, it was an interesting, something that caught her attention. She wants more information about it.
Okay, so basically suspension is just when you're not allowed to come on into school or come into school property for a couple days, while being expelled is when you are completely kicked out of school. So that's why the rates are higher to be suspended, because it takes more time to be suspended than it is for you to be expelled. That statistic, I would say, is an American statistic, but over here in Peel, Black students make up 10% of the secondary school population, but we make up for about 25% of all the suspensions. And it goes back to that subconscious bias that a lot of teachers may have, that they haven't really uprooted yet, that the fuse for Black students is a lot shorter. So a white student may get a warning for something that a Black student will get suspended for, or will get some sort of harsh punishment for, because of that shorter fuse.
Thanks so much. That was a very comprehensive answer. But Courtney, would you like to add anything else about lived experiences of your friends or yourselves, or anything else you'd like to add to Leah's response?
I also would say that in our recent anti-Black racism report in Peel, the highest reason for suspension was marked under other for Black students. So Black students were actually getting suspended for things that were not in the jurisdiction of suspension. So that shows you a lot as well.
And as for seeing it around, at my school, we had a rough year the year before last, and there were a lot of kids getting into fights. There were Black students, there were South Asian students, there were white students getting into fights, and you would see time and time and again that those white students or those South Asian students that would get into fights, they were at school the next day. As for my friends who were Black that would get into fights, I wouldn't be seeing them for the next 2 weeks.
Wow, very significant. And and it reflects sort of that the things that other students might not notice, you notice and feel. And so it carries a weight beyond just that one student who perhaps was experienced that injustice, but that you all felt it in ways.
I just wanted to add that I want everyone to consider how we respond to certain emotions in our society. I know that we have been trained to really think about sadness and think about depression. And when I mean think about it, if you have a classmate or a student that comes to school and they're really sad, we tend to go over to that person and ask them how they are and ask them if they need help. Same if we have a student that is expressing depression, we tend to really check in on those people. I think where we struggle though as a society is how we respond to anger. And I know, Aaliyah, in your example, you were talking about students getting into fights. Sometimes anger is a valid emotion when students are feeling frustration. But as a society, we don't respond to anger in the same way. When we see people that are angry, oftentimes we back away from them, or we tend to punish them. We speak about their tone. Don't use that tone of anger. Don't be so upset. And I think for you as students, and even for teachers and adults in this conversation today, I want you to really do a deep dive in terms of how you consider anger and what you interpret it to be about. And what if ongoing acts of racism is a legitimate reason for being upset and being frustrated? And how as we can, as educators and friends and peers, reach out to people around us that might be angry and might be frustrated in a way that's not punitive, in a way that actually brings them into the conversation and asks, how can we help you? How can we support you? So I just throw that out there for consideration.
Can I say something?
Absolutely.
I want to say also for Black men and men in general, they're taught that they can express sadness, they can express emotional feelings that in society are seen as feminine. So they counteract their inner feelings and they address it by using anger. And that is really that is for Black men, it is really hard for them, and society, because society already sees them as threatening and they don't understand how to handle those feelings and emotions when they show their anger, which is really internal sadness. It's really hard for other people to deal with that because they see Black men as threatening already. So when they show this anger, they get in trouble for it, and they get higher, as Aaliyah was explaining, higher suspension rates because they're seen as a threat. But the anger is not handled by counselors and seen as, okay, they're just hurting and they don't know how to express it, because in society we teach men that they have to be all huncho and you can't be sad, no crying, men don't cry. Right? So for Black men, the fact that we're teaching them that in society, it affects them and impacts them in a worser rate because they're seen as a threat in society. And
Thank you for sharing that, Courtney. I think that's an absolutely legitimate point. We are getting into some deep psychology here on this call today, so I really appreciate some of the observations you're making. How do we allow people to express certain emotions and other people not? I want to check in with the questions on the chat because there's quite a few. What are some ways that students can get involved in the fight against racism? Courtney and Ali, I'd love to hear from you on this. I shocked you.
Okay, I'll go. um, some ways to get involved, I would say, is start initiatives around the school and really start. I would say the basis and the foundation that you have to set for yourself is education. That's what I would say, because education gets you far. Because once you understand the other person, you can begin to work with the other person, understand their experience, and get a full depth of what they're going through. And I think for me and like my friends that are allies that aren't Black, or like even my Black friends, it helped us when we had a deeper understanding of ourselves, and when we as Black students we understood our history and we are educated on our history, and then our friends also were using the internet to understand their history, so they had a deep understanding of who they were, and then they were able to learn our history and vice versa, so we could really sit there and deeply know who we are as people and how we all have things in common, and there shouldn't be this divide. So I would say education and educating yourself is the first place to start.
Leah, what about you?
Yeah, and I would definitely say as well that don't feel pressured that you have to make some sort of grand gesture to prove that you are an ally of Black students. As long as you are able to see the subconscious bias that you have within yourself, and you're trying to be one less subconsciously racist person, makes the world of a difference for another person. So learning things that you may say or you may constantly do to your Black friends that could be ignorant, that makes a big difference within their lives. Or as Courtney was saying, like educate yourself on certain points so that you will now be able to understand the Black community better for the things that they do.
And Aliyah, I think that's a great point, and it links into a great question out of Toronto. Someone is asking, what is the best way to address microaggressions? You were talking about how people could take awareness of their actions, and so I think this question is a great thing for us to consider. So what is the best way if you are the victim of a microaggression? How can you respond to that?
I would say personally, one tactic that I've kind of learned is to embrace it. If people are asking you questions about your hair, that's something that you need to be able to embrace so that they'll be able to go forth and educate themselves more. Because us as Black people, we've suppressed ourselves and our culture so much so that we are able to assimilate with I guess our dominant culture, which would be white culture. So a lot of, for example, Black women, Black men, we're now being able to embrace our hair more, which just causes people to see and deem Black hair as something that's normal, not crazy. So I would say definitely embrace your speed, embrace your hair. People are always going to have something to say about you, but don't look outside for validation. As long as you validate yourself as a Black person, as a Black man, you will be able to conquer anything.
Awesome point. Courtney, did you have anything to add to that? How do you respond to microaggressions? What's a great way for someone to consider responding to microaggressions?
Well, again, if we kind of wanted to talk about hair, I guess, my grandma, my mom, and I were just talking about this, like because Black women we wear extensions a lot. It's historically a thing that we do, right? And like some people they find it disrespectful if you go up to someone and ask them, "Are you wearing weave?" But we were, and that's a little bit of a microaggression, right? So we were saying like, I don't get take it personal when that happens, and I actually say, "Okay, yeah, I am wearing weave. Like I'm not ashamed of it. I bought it." Like right. So you just explain to them, and this is how it's put in. Do you want to see it? Like they do this. This is the procedure. Because again, it's about education. It's about understanding the other person so that you don't see things as weird. And again, now in society, as Leo was saying, that black hair, afros, wearing your hair out as a Black woman, that was seen as unprofessional. But the more that that people that aren't our color can understand our process, they can identify it as something that is professional, and that's just their hair. But if we as Black people continue to feel disrespected when stuff like that happens and not embrace it for who we are, as Leo was explaining, then things are not going to change. So it's from both sides. We have to not change ourselves, but we have to we have to develop ourselves further so that other people that aren't like us can also develop themselves. That's what I would say. So it's both sides.
I love this concept of give and take, right? You know, sharing a little bit of information, being considerate when you ask questions to get information. I think that's a really great concept. Courtney, I want to touch early on a point that you made about the need to educate yourself and educate others. And I think this links to a fantastic question that Estelle out of Winnipeg has asked. And she's wanting to know, what kind of events does your BSA United Souls organize? And since you brought up the element of self-education and educating others, I'm hoping you can share the response to that question in kind of that context.
So at our BSc, we go around and we facilitate workshops, whether that's within school or outside of school. And a lot of our workshops are based on Black history and the historical significance of Black contribution. And then we also go around and talk about things like microaggressions, unconscious bias, so that people can get that deeper understanding. So as our BSA, we really make sure that we go out there, get into the community so they understand our perspective and experiences.
And I will add, because I know both Courtney and Aaliyah are too modest to say this, not only do they talk to their peers, but they also talk to students who are in universities as well. And they talk to adults about their lived experience. So I just want to put it out there that your BSA isn't necessarily limited to just work within your high school. It's not just limited to doing work with other high schools. You can really talk to anybody who wants to know more and hear from you about your lived experience. So that's something to consider out there for those of you that want to start a BSA. I'm just checking, there's so many questions. Here's a great one, and this comes from Edmonton. How do you respond to All Lives Matter? I've upped the ante on you there. Actually, the person from Edmonton did. How do you respond to All Lives Matter? I think that's a question actually out of Brazil.
Yeah, I think we could both answer this one because we probably both do different things. But I would say that, again, I love education, so we're gonna have a little bit of a debate. It's not gonna get too hyped, but we're gonna have a conversation about your stance, my stance, and then we can agree to disagree, or we can both gain education from different standpoints and understand each other a bit more. But what I would always say is that Black Lives Matter is not about excluding other lives, because of course I'm going to say it, all lives do matter. That is a true statement. However, what Black Lives Matter is about is ensuring that Black lives are equally measured up to other people's lives, because we are seeing that society is demonstrating to us, we actually have the statistics that Black lives are being disproportionately affected and impacted. So that would be my response to somebody that said that to me.
Thank you, Courtney. Aaliyah, what about you?
Also, All Lives Matter is only a counter movement to Black Lives Matter. So with that being said, let's put it in another terms that would make sense. For example, my family's from Jamaica. Jamaica is flooding right now. If I say pray for Jamaica, that doesn't mean that I don't care about the country that I currently live in, which is Canada. It just means that Jamaica is suffering right now. So we need to put some focus on the fact that Jamaica is suffering. So that's the thing with Black Lives Matter as well, because the two is silent. So it's Black Lives Matter too. Black Lives Matter as well. It doesn't mean that Black Lives Matter more than anybody else. It's just the fact that we are going through things that nobody really cares about. There are certain benefits that people who are the standard receive that Black people don't receive, which is why people don't understand that disconnect of why Black people are fighting so much for the things that we do need and deserve.
I the way I love saying it is saying save the whales doesn't mean kill the pandas. You can do both. And so when you say Black Lives Matter, that doesn't mean at the expense of every other life. You can do all the things. It's not prioritizing one. I love what you said, Aaliyah, Black Lives Matter too, not Black Lives Matter only. A great question out of Alaska. That state has a huge Indigenous population, similar to Canada. And so the question there is, has your BSA seen an increased interest from Indigenous students in terms of wanting to participate and sharing their similar experience around microaggressions?
At our school, we don't have a big Indigenous population. However, we do talk about the Indigenous experience because their experience is very close to the Black experience. And when you actually learn history, we know that before the discovery of the Americas by European explorers, Black people actually were in the Americas, and they are the Indigenous population has Black heritage. So their experience is very close to ours because we actually have a relation and a connected relation. So we also like to learn about their experience because it's our experience too, right? So it's very, very important.
Thanks, Courtney. Aaliyah, do you have anything to add?
I would say that they do experience similar microaggressions for sure. How can we help in, oh, sorry, I was reading a question. Yeah, they definitely experience their own microaggressions for sure. And the only thing that I would say, or not the only thing, but one thing that really helped is that we kind of have a set Western standard, which is very close to the European standard of how one should act, one should be. Once you're able to dismantle that and see that there are people who don't live within that standard, but they are completely right to do so. And once you're able to accept people doing what they do, appreciating their culture, then a lot of those microaggressions will drop significantly because you're not trying to hold anybody to a standard that they do not relate to or they're not a part of.
Thank you for those answers. I would also add for our friends in Alaska to consider that in Canada, I know Courtney talked about the historical relationship of Black people being Indigenous to North America, but there are a lot of Black Indigenous people who have both Black heritage and Indigenous heritage. And I find that sometimes when we talk about it, we tend to talk about it as two separate lanes. But I just want to acknowledge for our brothers and sisters who do have Black and Indigenous heritage, they are part of both communities. And sometimes they are facing dual challenges in terms of the racism they face, and sometimes being excluded from one community or the other. So I just want to put that out there, that that relationship is historical, but it's also ongoing and present between the Indigenous community and the Black community. I'm going to ask a personal question that comes to us out of BC. If you don't want to answer it, you don't have to, but either Aaliyah and Courtney, have you ever been expelled or suspended as a result of racism?
You hear my mom in the back? I have.
Me too.
So basically, the way that that question is worded is kind of difficult. I wasn't suspended due to racism, but racism did have a part to play in the way that my suspension was acted out and the post effects of my suspension. So United Souls has been a group that has been around since my school has opened, maybe about 7 or 8 years ago. And I had actually gotten into a fight right? But the background of that fight was that girl had been bothering me for a very, very long time. Since I was younger, like it was a lot. And it came to a point where, as we all know, like anger is something that ends up building up. I have a very clean record. I have never been in a fight before. And it's crazy to see how teachers knowing who I am, teachers knowing the type of student that I am, teachers knowing the way that I advocate for Black rights, people, teachers just knowing who I am, that one fight flipped that 180 on me, if that makes sense. So automatically teachers lost that respect for me. Teachers didn't see me as being a student that was worthy in a sense. And I find that very crazy because why do Black students only get one chance? We only get one chance. Other students, they can mess up as many times as they want, but it's not going to change the way that teachers view them. I messed up one time, and even my group felt the backlash of that. Why is it that me getting into a fight kind of ruined the way that my entire school viewed my group? Why is my actions, why does the actions of one Black person blanket or express the actions of all Black people? So we need to get rid of that whole mindset of, oh, all Black people are the same, because we're not. Just because I got into one fight doesn't mean that it represents the actions of Courtney, doesn't mean it represents the actions of other people in United Souls. So that just goes to show that racism may not cause me to get suspension, but the racism is the reason why that suspension's effects lasted a lot longer than they really should have.
Thank you for sharing that, Aaliyah. I think it's important for people to really hear that. Sometimes students who are not Black get the benefit of second, third, fourth, and fifth chances. And it's really interesting and insightful to self-reflect and ask why we don't do that for Black students as well. And so I hope that's something that people can walk away from this conversation and reflect on for sure. Courtney, I know that you wanted to jump in on that question as well about suspensions.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I feel as Black students, especially Black students in Aaliyah and I's position, where we are like scholar students, we do very well in school, we contribute to the community, we always feel the need to have to be turned on, because we know in that one instance, that one mistake, everything can be gone for you. So we always have that inner feeling where we have to be turned on. We don't get time to just breathe and be ourselves and be within ourselves, because we always have to live up to the expectations of others around us, especially to European expectations. And I would say it really affects us because we're not allowed to just be ourselves sometimes, right? So especially when it comes to being in trouble, getting in trouble, being in the wrong situation, wrong place at the wrong time, that one thing that you do, as Leo was saying, that can change everything for you as a Black student. So we, and also because we have to advocate for the other Black students around us, because we know what they're going through, and we know that we have the capacity to be able to advocate for themselves when they don't have the capacity to advocate for themselves, right? So we always have to know that, okay, we represent this so that we can help our own people and get our own people ahead, because sometimes due to their circumstances, they can't do it for themselves. And that requires us always to be turned on, centered, tunnel vision, get to the point, make sure that we don't steer off the point. And that's hard for us, right?
Courtney, I want to ask you a follow-up question to that, but before I do, I just want to put it out there that if anyone has a question that they want to ask, you can turn yourself off mute and I can bring you into the conversation. So just get your question ready. And as a follow-up to that, Courtney, you always have to be on. I'm hoping you can talk to me about what that pressure must be like day after day in terms of having to expend that much mental energy, in terms of being your best self all the time.
It's really hard to even put it into words what that means, because it doesn't mean that I'm not being my most authentic self, but it also means that I'm living up to somebody else's standards of what they want me to be. And that's because I have to conform to their societal norms, and that's not my normal. And if I don't conform to their societal norms, that means that I'm outcasted. So it really means not always being your authentic self, not always being who you are and who you want to be able to be in the society that you live in. That's what I would say. So imagine living somewhere, being home. You come home, and even in your own home, I call Canada home, my own home. I can't be my authentic true self because I'm always living up to this standard. And if I don't live up to that standard, the I'll get kicked out. That's what it feels like. That's the best analogy I could give to you.
Thank you for that really honest response. I appreciate it. Is there anyone on the call who would love to ask a question? Please turn yourself off mute, and we will bring you into the chat.
I don't want to call anyone out, but I know that Trafalgar had a question. If they wanted to unmute their microphone and they could ask it directly. Here they come.
Oh,
Bonjour. Hi.
Hi. Hi, everybody.
All right, Trafalgar, if one of you would like to come up close to the microphone to ask your question, we would love to have your question.
go for it, Makina.
So just are there some ways directly that that students can get involved in like very like big Black Lives Matter like marches, or just how to kind of like speak their mind about it?
Did you hear the question, Courtney and Aaliyah? Who wants to take it first? Aaliyah, go.
Yeah, I would say that because you're pretty young, you do not need to go to a march to prove that you are an advocate of Black people. I've never been to a march, and I'm an advocate for myself and my community. So it's really just there's so many little things that you can do at home, whether it is having that conversation with your parents about Black Lives Matter, because for a lot of other people that I've seen, it's like they may have progressive views, but their parents might not be there yet, or it might not click to their parents yet. So having those conversations with your family, having those conversations with the people around you, just to have that spark going, to make sure that people don't forget about like but to forget about Black people that are going through it. Because Black Lives Matter, it always happens where so many people are supporting us at first, and then after a while, Black people look behind us and it's like, where did everybody go? You know, so it's like, don't forget about us and continue to keep that conversation sparked and alive.
Courtney, did you have a response to that question?
I know, I think Aaliyah said it perfectly. Yeah.
That's a great question, and I thank you so much for asking it. And I think there's different ways we can all get involved. And I want you to keep in mind, and I think Aaliyah, you said this earlier, it doesn't have to be these grand, big ways. You could write a letter to your mayor, to your principal, to your city councilor. You can ask your parents to get you certain types of books or movies out of the library. Get you a library card if you don't have one, and think about all the different resources. Take you to certain movies that you want to see. You can ask your parents to shop at certain stores that you know are Black owned or sell products made by Black people that you really admire. So yes, there's protests and there's marches as one avenue. That's one way, but there are a whole bunch of other ways too. A great way is think about the toys that you can buy for your younger siblings. People often think that you have to buy Black toys for Black kids. What if we gave Black dolls to everybody? And it's just a normal part of sort of the stuff that we play with. So maybe that's something you can ask your parents to do. But there's lots of ways. So I really thank you for asking the question. It's a great one. Thank you, Trafalgar.
Thank you so much.
No problem. Any other questions?
Can I ask a question?
Yes, absolutely. It's Daxton. How are you?
I'm good. This question is for Courtney. Earlier, she said that the school, like the school system, racism in the school system, and how they like they don't teach a lot of Black achievements and like stuff like that. So I was wondering, what are some of the big achievements that you feel don't get talked about enough?
Well, I would say a lot of the achievements when it comes to math and sciences of Black people, that doesn't get spoken about at all. When you look in our textbooks, a lot of the scholars that are referenced are white scholars like Isaac Newton, Einstein, Pythagoras, as we were speaking about. And then when you do your own history dive, when you read your own books on the side, that's why I say education is key. You then start to learn that, wait, Isaac Newton didn't do this. That's just as an example. Pythagoras, as I was explaining, didn't do this. It was actually Black people in Egypt, Black people in Africa that discovered these things thousands of years in their civilizations. And another thing that I want to talk about is a lot in school we teach about pioneers. We also teach about explorers from Europe that discovered the Americas. But then when you do look into history, we find out that Columbus, he found America due to African more explorers that were coming back from the Americas to Africa, and they actually taught him the route to get to the Caribbean and to get to America. And we see that hundreds of years before Europe discovered America, Africans were already there inhabiting it. And we see that within historical context, the pyramids that we find in places like Mexico. We see that in the monuments that we find there, that the monuments are very similar to African monuments that we find in Africa, which shows the presence of Africa within the Americas years before Europeans got there. So you really have to do your own deep dive. There's actually a book that I wanted to refer to you guys today, sorry, and that is called They Came Before Columbus by Sheikh Anta Diop. And I believe we have a reading list that you guys will get after this. So that will be in the reading list. But that talks about the coming of Africans to the Americas before Columbus. And Indigenous people also have African heritage because of this. So the Indigenous people we see today, they are Indigenous to Africa, and they would have came to the Americas, and we know them as Indigenous Americans. Yeah, Native Americans. Thank you.
I think this is a really great question, Daxton, and I will encourage you to think about some of the things that we take for granted that exist. I think most mainstream music genres that we listen to today originated out of historical African instrumentation, whether it's rhythm and blues, bluegrass, country. Recently, there was the movie Hidden Figures that spoke about the contribution of Black women mathematicians and scientists to launching the space program out of NASA. The entire field of anesthesiology, the stuff they use when you go for surgery, the doctor that is credited with coming up with anesthesiology, 95% of his experiments were done on Black women without their consent. And a lot of that is left out of history books. So, I mean, as Courtney said, there's so many examples, and it all involves a deep dive, and we'll be sure to put that book that Courtney recommended in the chat. Mr. Sparks, you have a question.
Well, I actually have tons of questions, but I actually have a couple of comments. We have to leave here in Alaska. Our class ends at 9:08, and a lot of my students have to go join their other Zoom class. This has been absolutely fantastic. Aaliyah and Courtney, you are two of the best presenters I have ever been in, and I've been doing this for a long time. Your clarity, your conciseness, your personal stories, just unbelievable. In fact, I'm going to ask you two if we could get some information, communication links. I'd like to have you speak to my government students next semester when we're on some of these topics. I was blown away by your guys' professionalism, your knowledge, and like I say, your skills. So again, we have questions. I wanted to let that know. I want you two to know, and Destiny, you as well. We need to exchange an email so that we can stay in contact. I'd like to get you in front of my students next semester. But other than that, we have to leave in Alaska. That's why I wanted to say, and not be rude by all of us just jumping out, but thank you very much from Alaska.
Have a great morning, Alaska. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon.
And I know Sarah can help us get some email connections and things like that. Looking forward to it. Awesome job today, everybody. Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
There is a great question coming out of Edmonton, and that is, you know, these conversations on racism and Black Lives Matter and student advocacy have been happening for quite a while. And I know Aaliyah and Courtney, you have been speaking on this quite eloquently, going out, educating your peers, educating adults. Does it ever get exhausting having to talk about this constantly, having to advocate for your own humanity?
Yes, it does because I like the word you used, humanity, advocating for your humanity. That should be a human instinct that is within everyone, that they should think another human is worth as much as everyone, right? Like you would think that that's a normal thing to believe. So the fact that we have to go out and teach other people as students, as kids, that we are worth as much as you are, it does get tough. It does get hard, and it's hard on your emotional psyche as well, because like I have to teach these people that I'm good enough. How come they can't just see that I'm a human being just like them, right? So it's hard, but we like know that by me and Aaliyah doing this, we're helping so many other Black students that don't have a voice. So that's my standpoint on it. Also, quickly, I got the books that I was talking about, so I'm just gonna give you guys a quick visual of them. So this one is called "They Came Before Columbus" by Ivan Van Sertima. He's a very good scholar to note if you if you want to learn a lot more about Black history, African history, and the African presence globally, because they're not teaching us that right now in school. So you want to educate yourself. So "They Came Before Columbus" by Ivan Van Sertima, and then another one by Ivan Van Sertima. Sorry, "The Global African Presence." This is a very good one. So those are for you guys to find. They should be in a reading list that we'll have after the meeting.
Thank you for sharing those resources. They came before us. And what was the second one again, Courtney?
So "They Came Before Columbus" and "The Global African Presence."
Perfect. And we'll make sure that those resources are shared afterwards in the list that's going around. There's another question that I wanted to get to here. And so it's coming from the perspective of a teacher and students. And they're asking, what are some small changes that are positive that we can make every day in our classrooms in order to sort of combat the microaggressions and the Europeanized curriculums that we have? So, I mean, in a way, you've answered this, Courtney, by sharing resources, but are there any other suggestions that you might have?
I would say the internet is your best friend. We live in the internet era. I'm glad to live in it too, because I know that my parents weren't able to educate themselves on their own history. So the fact that I have the internet, I know myself way more. So even if you don't want to explore Black history, you can explore your own history and understand yourself. You can explore Black history and understand the other person. So I would say the internet. And then the internet, make sure when you're on there, you're seeing that these articles that you're reading, the PDFs that you're reading, they cite their sources, and then you can also go out and find those books so that you know that it's a reliable source. But I would say start there, start with the internet, and then from there move on to books, move on to watching webinars. There's a lot of things like the Zoom calls that you can join that are about African history, Black history, the Black experience.
Aaliyah, anything you wanted to add to that question?
No, I would definitely agree. The internet is definitely something that's there. And I would say incorporating some of the things that you learn into your lessons. Like, don't make Black History Month, February, the only time you talk about the things that are happening in the Black community. You can incorporate, say, for example, when you're talking about Pythagorean theory in class, you can let your kids know, like, even though we call it this is not the true name of it. This is not where everything comes from. When you talk about Columbus, you can talk about those sailors from Mali that came and discovered the Americas. So there's definitely little information points that you can add to your lessons. You don't have to make a huge lesson about Black history or just the Black community in general, but just include us.
I think that's a great point. Think about all the resources that you're bringing into your space, teachers. Who authored those resources? Who are the protagonists in those works and pieces of literature? How are Black characters portrayed? Are they the sidekick? Are they taking autonomous action in support of their own lives? Think about how simple choices in terms of the material you read can have a huge impact in showing Black people, Black youth in a more rounded way than just athletes or sidekicks. How can we make that color, that perspective broader than what we've been socialized to think? And this is a really great way to think about that. Any other questions? Does anyone want to get on camera, unmute yourself and join the conversation? Sarah, any other comments that are coming in from our YouTube participants?
Oh, we had a couple of good ones. I think I've shared them already. And I mean, I think for everyone, the key was, what could they do? You know, like there's this feeling, oftentimes we get bogged down in a feeling of guilt, and that's not a productive place. We need to be in a feeling of action, right? Of moving forward, and that's a lot of language you use around reconciliation. And this is a type of reconciliation of looking at ourselves, of looking at our society. And so thank you so much for sharing all those actions, because really every question came back to that idea of how do we build better schools? How do we build better societies? So.
I see Queen. Oh, sorry, Courtney, go ahead.
Okay. I was going to say, I think we also need to start looking at as Destin was explaining a little bit, where that curriculum that we're teaching comes from, the depth of it, where it stems from. And we also have to look at the fact that in history, Europe was looking to colonize the world and become a world power. So they shaped the things that they teach us in a way that they could remain supreme. So if you're trying to remain supreme, you would teach that the other person isn't as intelligent as you, because you want yourself to be looked at as the higher status, right? So that's how our curriculum is shaped. It's shaped so that Europeans are looked at as the victors, the people that achieved everything, so that Europe could ensure that they remain the world power. So we have to look at where the things we're teaching kids stem from and see if that is the right place for what we want our kids to understand.
And something else that's very traumatic when you teach things like that is that even though we still teach that Europeans may have done really bad things in the past, we also find a way to kind of turn that story around and make them the victors. You can't be the villain and the hero in the same story. That's not how it works. There's so many times, like the Galloway Wars in America, where we were able to free ourselves from slavery, but yet we teach in schools that it was Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln didn't save us. We put him in a position where he was forced to do these things. So there's so many parts of history that make Black people or Black students kind of look at themselves as lowly, because it's like we can't even fight for ourselves, when in reality we're not giving our ancestors that justice where they were able to fight for themselves and free themselves, meaning that us as Black students, young Black people that are older, we are able to fight for our own freedom and fight for our own futures as well. We don't need anybody to validate us and make us eligible to do the things that we want to do.
Oh my goodness, the questions. Now that people have a deadline, they're rolling in online all over the place. So Dustin and Aaliyah and Courtney, if people want to reach out to you, if they have these questions, whether it be through Twitter or emailing me and we get them to you, how can they, are you welcome? How do they continue these conversations? Because they're really rolling in.
I'm fine with people emailing me. I'm always open to talk about the conversation, ensure that people understand. So I don't frown upon that. Email me, contact me through however you can find me. And I'm sure that our emails will be given out. So contact me. Feel free to do so.
And does United Souls have a Twitter page or a Facebook page or somewhere they can find you on?
We have an Instagram.
Instagram, awesome. So they'll just look for you there. And Dustin, how about yourself?
You can find me on Twitter at Demand Different. My email address will probably be shared as a follow-up to this. I am fine with that. I would encourage that you keep having these conversations with each other. Aaliyah, Courtney, and I don't necessarily have to be involved, but sometimes it's just enough talking it through. And then once you've had that conversation, engage others in that conversation. So I am here to support outreach. And if you want to get in touch with me, I'm happy to make that happen.
Wonderful. Well, I want to thank Destin, Aaliyah, Courtney, Peel School District, David Suzuki High School, UNESCO, everyone who's joined us today. We've had schools from Surrey, Kelowna, Vancouver, Airdrie, Edmonton, Saskatoon, Toronto, Halifax. We've had online. I've seen our students from Bangladesh and Brazil, Trinidad, and of course our friends from Alaska who joined us today in the meeting. I want to thank all the schools who joined us. I know that our friends at the Canadian Commission for UNESCO would also like to extend a message, so I invite Isabel to say something here in the last couple of minutes. Isabel.
Oh, I'll be very brief. I wanted to say the same thing, Sarah. But first of all, big shout out to Courtney and Aaliyah. That was an amazing session. I learned so much. Of course, also to their teacher and ally, Clayton, I'd like to give a big shout out to him, who's been helping United Souls at the school, the Center for Global Education, and Destin Lord. And I just want to say a little bit about our work with Destin. So for the teachers that are online, still online, I'll share with you the link, or when we share with you the links. There was professional development that happened this last summer and spring for teachers about talking about racism in the classroom. And there's a great list of resources, and actually even a webinar that was recorded that can be accessible for teachers and your classrooms. So I think as it's already been shared, I think it's a shared responsibility for students, for teachers, for school administrators, and for the larger community, including me as a parent. I think we all need to participate in that. And I think there was such great messages for all of us. So a big shout out to all of you. So thank you.
And Destin, Aaliyah, over to you for the final words. And Courtney.
One thing that I really, like, me and Courtney really wanted to like drive home as well is that even though we're doing things like this for you guys to be able to educate yourselves, we want you guys to be able to take this and run with it. You guys should be able at some point in time to be able to teach other people yourselves and not always depend on those prime Black students, which would be me and Courtney, to advocate for everybody else. You at some point in time will be able to gain enough knowledge and information that you will be able to advocate for the Black community like by yourself as well.
I definitely,
Go ahead.
I definitely agree with Aaliyah. You need to like take from what you learned from us and from other workshops that you're in and utilize it. But I also want to thank you guys for allowing us to come to you and to teach you and being open to learn, being open to understand, and being open to change. And that's what I have to say. So thank you.
As an adult, I'm always humbled by how much I have to learn from the generations that are behind me. And I think as adults, sometimes we lose sight of the fact that we can learn so much from the young people around us. And I think it was very clear today from the lessons that Courtney and Aaliyah graciously shared with us that we need to listen to teens, we need to listen to young people and center their voices at this conversation. So personally, I want to thank Aaliyah and Courtney for allowing me to just be in your space. And I want to thank both Isabel and Sarah for having me be a moderator on this call today. I want to give a personal shout out to my Trinidad family. Thank you for joining us. And I just wanted to say thank you, everyone, for taking the time to learn, taking the time to have conversations that are hard, but we obviously need to have them. So with that, enjoy your day, your morning, and thank you for being a part of this learning journey. We can all do better when we do it together. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye. Bye, everyone. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye, Toronto.